Our next speaker is Peter Richerson. He received his PhD in zoology in 1969 from the University of California at Davis, and he worked for many years in the field of limnology. Then he now has worked for 15 years on cultural evolution, so applying evolutionary theory to how culture changes through time. And so today he'll talk to us about, I forgot to say he's a distinguished professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at UC Davis now, and today he'll talk about Not by Genes Alone, Darwinian Methods for the Study of Cultural Evolutions and Gene-Culture Coevolution.
Thank you, Diane, for that introduction, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I'm having a good time. So let me ask one question, just out of curiosity. How many people here have given The Origin of Species at least one pretty solid read? How many people have given The Descent of Man a good solid read? Okay, well that's a pretty good ratio. If many in the circles that I travel, in social science circles, the answer to both questions would have been a tiny scatter of hands. So what I want to do today is talk to you a little bit about what Darwin had to say in The Descent of Man, and then a little bit about what those of us who've been interested in cultural evolution and gene-culture coevolution have done since. Darwin, of course, traveled on the voyage of the Beagle, had a lot of experiences with all sorts of people on that voyage. So he wasn't a mean ethnographer, and he did quite a lot of correspondence with people after the voyage of the Beagle, trying to acquire information about other peoples around the world. And he was, by The Descent of Man at least, he was a cultural evolutionist. So you can see in this quote here that he says that the most efficient causes of progress seem to consist of good education during youth, while the brain is impressible, high standard of excellence inculcated by the ablest and best men, I guess you'd say men and women these days, embodied in the laws, customs, and traditions of the nation, and enforced by public opinion. So this is important in the Descent. And Darwin had three rather modern notions about human evolution, and I think these are poorly appreciated by most people, except those who are close scholars of Darwin. One was that, unlike many of his contemporaries, he was skeptical about the notion of progress. So he could see progress and regression. And for him, progress wasn't anything automatic that you could depend upon. It was maybe possible. I'll talk about that a little bit. But not, by no means guaranteed, like Spencer, by some inexorable law of nature. He thought there were no organically primitive species. Now, of course, Darwin's working before Mendel, so he doesn't, well, he wasn't working before Mendel, but he was working before Mendelism, I guess you should say. So he doesn't make the clean distinction that we would make these days between genes and culture. But I think I can convince you that he thought that the organic evolution of humans, that their social instincts, as he called them in the context of behavior, were primordial, that they evolved a long time ago. And any advance in human behavior, if any, was due to improved conditions. So in another way of putting this, that the genetic constitution of people was more or less uniform. Of course, Darwin saw variation everywhere, so he didn't think that anything was interesting trait was without variation. But the great diversity of humans was due to cultural traditions, not to genetic differences. He was also, at least as regards humans, a group selectionist. So he thought that the social instincts of humans particularly were a product of selection at the tribal level. So let me just put a little flesh on those bones. So ambivalent about progress. The first quote there is from his end notebook that he was compiling during the time that he was formulating his first clear theory of natural selection. And you can see there that he didn't think there'd been any, or at least no automatic, dependable progress. And he notes that modern Spaniards, to his way of thinking, of course he had a lot of experience in the New World, were less impressive than the ancient Greeks, so that there's no automatic tendency to progress except in favorable circumstances. Now, Darwin did have a rather sophisticated theory of moral progress in humans, and Robert Richards, a philosopher and historian of science, has articulated what that is, and I won't have time to go through it. It's a whole other lecture. It's really interesting. And of course, later on, people like Popper and Donald Campbell, who were introducing evolutionary epistemology and an evolutionary theory of the progress of science. This kind of conditional progressiveness is, there's some interesting theories along those lines, even if we don't, in other words, we shouldn't throw progress out along with these Spencerian kinds of ideas. I don't think that progress isn't necessarily automatic, but that doesn't mean that by some definition or another it can't happen. So no organically primitive races. This is a quote out of the Descent of Man, where Darwin is this chapter is concerned with the evolution of the differences between races, and so you can see there he was struggling with two hypotheses. In the arguments of the day, it was whether humans were one species or multiple species, whether each race was a separate species, and he spends quite a bit of time in the chapter on the races, weighing these two hypotheses. So he spent several pages laying out the arguments for why humans might be considered separate species, and then he spent several pages demolishing that hypothesis. And this is the capstone of the demolishment. And so he recounts his own. I didn't mean to do that. He recounts his own experiences with the Fuegians on board the Beagle and a full-blooded Negro with whom I happened to once be intimate. I don't think intimate means quite the same thing in Victorian English that it does so this wasn't a confessional novel exactly, although a great many Victorians might not have cared to be even intimate, even in the Victorian sense, with a full-blooded Negro. Well, you're reading the thing there. I don't have to read it myself. So the idea is that there are very many little differences, or rather, very many detailed similarities between the races, and it's hard to believe that they're separate species. And this, as I say, comes at the end of a long argument, arguing that he says this argument holds with good or equal or greater force with respect to numerous points of mental similarity between the most distinctive races. So particularly in the case of mental traits, he thought that humans were one species and differed not appreciably from one another. So he thinks that the same social instincts prevail in all humans, and that particularly the instinct of sympathy. This is an idea he shared with Adam Smith, that the instinct of sympathy could be a motivator of moral progress, because when you sympathized with others, then you felt their pain, and that may lead you to take steps in your own behavior or to favor social institutions that relieve the problems of another group of people. So he applied this, for example, to his opposition to slavery. But the point here is that he's already talked about how moral progress can come about, and he says he's already said enough while treating the lower races. He still uses that kind of higher and lower distinction, but the causes of progress are the same in advanced and the lower and higher civilizations, and the causes which lead to the advanced morality, namely the approbations of our fellow men, the strength of our sympathies by habit, example and imitation, reason, experience, even self-interest, instruction during youth, and religious feelings. These are the same in the lower and higher civilizations. So the diversity of humans then is, in Darwin's mind, due to cultural evolution. And he here is talking about in the same argument, the various kinds of detailed resemblances between humans that anybody who's described species would look upon the variation that one saw in humans as subspecific variation, population variation, certainly not different species. And the part in red there, I do not here refer to similar customs. So it's the customs that make the diversity, not the genes. Well, of course, not the organic inheritance. How Darwin thought that culture and organic inheritance were coupled is an interesting question. He had this idea of inherited habits, so that essentially that it's an inheritance of acquired variation, of course, which he also believed in. So the way he thought about inheritance is complicated, but it ends up having much the same flavor as the modern genes and culture distinction. There were some things that were conservative and changed slowly. There were other things that were susceptible to modification and changed more quickly. And then there was culture, which was transmitted as traditions. Now, as I say, Darwin was also a group selectionist, and this is the famous passage from the Descent where he outlines a theory of how group selection at the tribal level would work. Those individuals who are more patriotic, more willing to sacrifice for the group would aid the group at their own cost. So he's got the individual cost in there. But the tribes that had a greater number of people who are willing to sacrifice for the benefit of the tribe would cause their tribe to succeed at the expense of competing tribes, and this would be natural selection, he says. So he's a group selection. Of course, Darwin is also worried about this same general problem in the context of social insects. So, and he recognizes this as a big problem, that ordinarily advantages are going to accrue to individuals, and it's hard to imagine how self-sacrificing worker bees arose. And he talked his way through to a fairly modern picture of how, because the workers are related to the queen, that you can have social insects. And this is a similar argument. This is an exception. He's not treating this group selection as a rule. He's imagining that this is something that is restricted to a few different kinds of organisms, and humans just happen to be one of them. So now to the modern study of cultural evolution and gene culture coevolution. The historical picture here is very interesting because Darwin had a number of followers in the late 19th century, particularly the psychologist James Mark Baldwin and the economist Thorstein Veblen were pretty sophisticated evolutionary scientists. So this all had the look of something that was going to become permanent. But as the modern social science disciplines form, sociology, anthropology, and so on, as self-conscious, organized entities at the beginning of the 20th century, by probably just at that time, just a history of accidents, the idea of evolution as part of the social sciences just fell away. It just disappeared. It got lost. And it was partly, I think, because it was the nadir of Darwin's reputation. The mutation theory was thought to contradict evolution by natural selection, and so Darwin's own prestige was kind of the prestige of his version of evolutionary biology was kind of at a minimum then. But there are lots of other things that were probably there, and Robert Richards has documented this, done a historical study in the case of psychology, and economic historian by the name of Jeff Hodgson has done it for economics. There may be other stories that haven't been told for the other disciplines. And so the result, arguably, was a kind of a scientific disaster. So the social sciences went through the first 2/3 or so of the 20th century without any underpinnings in evolution at all, formal evolution. They didn't do mathematical models like the population geneticists started to do. They didn't develop field methods and experimental methods that were relevant to studying evolution. And so this is sort of, Peter Bowler was counterfactual. Here is a whole bunch of disciplines that needed evolution and didn't have it. Then in the late 20th century, at least the last 2/3 of the 20th century, there began to be a revival of evolutionary studies in the social sciences. This polymathic psychologist Donald T. Campbell, as I already mentioned in connection with evolutionary epistemology, wrote a series of papers in the 60s and up to the mid-70s. Luca Cavalli-Sforza and Mark Feldman started writing down population genetic style mathematical models in the early 70s. Richard Alexander wrote a book, Darwin and Human Affairs, in 1979, and E.O. Wilson's famous book that provoked the controversy over sociobiology was from his treatise on sociobiology, the last chapter in 1975. Then he and Charles Lumsden wrote a controversial book in 1981, and there are several others. Boyd and I actually wrote our first little paper on cultural evolution in 1976, so we got in not quite, we don't have any big priority for beginning this, but we got into this business fairly early, as did others. So it remained very controversial, and it still remains very controversial in the social sciences, whether the kinds of things that people in this room do have any relevance to what they do at all. That's quite controversial, but at least we've got the ball rolling. So I think you can divide the people who have been interested in this into two broad types, what I've called here substantivists and methodologists. So substantivists have been interested in applying evolutionary models directly to human behavior. So models like optimal foraging models drawn from behavioral ecology and applying them to foraging by hunters and gatherers and many things like that. So these models typically don't take any special account of culture. They assume that typically that many of these behaviors may have a big cultural component, but they'll still obey the fitness optimizing assumptions of those models. And then those of us who take a more methodological stance, so we're interested in actually modeling cultural evolution and the interactions of genes and culture in an evolutionary context. So we borrow concepts and methods rather than try to apply models directly to behavior and ask what happens when some of the information that codes for phenotypes is culturally transmitted. And so most of us who worked in this area based our study on these population genetics models, style models, pioneered by Cavalli-Sforza and Feldman. And now there are increasingly field studies. For a long time, the frequent and fair criticism of this line of work was that it was all done by theorists and was all pencil and paper, or computer simulations, all math and no data. Now, of course, there's an immense amount of data in the social sciences, so it's not like any of this was being conceived in an empirical vacuum. There was lots of data to constrain the models, and so the models that Rob Boyd and I, basic models that we derived, we took mostly out of the diffusion of innovations literature and related kinds of things. So they were definitely empirically inspired, but there weren't any or very few experiments directly designed to test these models, and that became an increasing problem. So lately, there's a lot more field studies and laboratory studies, and I'll try to tell you a little bit about that, time permitting. So one of the reasons why we need to be interested in cultural evolution in humans is that it's an overwhelming, as Darwin guessed, it's overwhelmingly responsible for variation in human behavior. So this is a study that one of my students and I and one of our other colleagues did. And so we just applied FST analysis to cultural variation and compared it to FST estimates for genes. So there's something called the World Values Survey, which has surveyed large numbers of people in many countries around the world. And so we could use the answers to that as if they were genetic loci and compute FST values for neighboring populations. We were interested in the possibility of group selection, so we were interested in neighboring populations. They're the ones who would actually compete and for which group selection might be possible. And you can see here in this histogram that the distribution of FST values for the cultural traits barely overlap the genetic traits. So neighboring human groups have very little genetic variation between the groups, with a few exceptions. So if I mean the 1-to-1 line here, if they were equal, it'd be run along here, something like that. And you can see that there's very little genetic variation. A few populations, neighboring populations, have a certain amount, but there's quite a lot of cultural variation, oftentimes between neighboring groups. So and there's reasons to think that our values of FST are underestimated. So there's a lot of variation here to explain. There's a lot of evolution going on in the cultural realm, and it's much more important in terms of variation than genetic variation. So let me just outline the basic elements of the methodological approach. So we define culture as information that's passed from one individual to another by teaching or imitation. Kids turn out to be phenomenal imitators by comparison. There's lots of nice experiments comparing chimpanzees and children now, and children are just little imitation machines. And of course, there's a certain amount of teaching of kids, and a massive amount in modern societies, substantially less in traditional societies. Deliberate teaching is not nearly so important outside of modern Western societies. And then I put stimulus enhancement there. That's I don't have time to describe it, but it's a sort of a crude form of quasi-imitation that's very widespread in the animal world. So there is a lot of culture in other animals. So almost all social animals that anybody's looked at have a certain amount of cultural transmission of traits by behavioral phenotypic transmission. But the quantitative amount of this is really hypertrophied in humans. Humans seem to have a whole lot more cultural variation, and it seems to be much more central to our adaptation than is the case in any other species. It's hard to believe that any species will turn up now that has as much culture as humans, which is too bad in a way because it handicaps doing comparative biology. So it'd be lovely to find an ant or something that has as much culture as humans. That'd be a lot of fun. Well, I don't know. They might be terrible pests like our Argentine ants in California, so got to be careful what you wish for. So culture is a form of inheritance. You get information from other people, and so that's a lot like genes, and that's what motivates the application of these population genetic style models. And by extension, we need to study the same kinds of things in the field, get the same kinds of data. But it's very different in detail from genes. So there's the inheritance of acquired variation is fundamental to it. Now, of course, there's a bunch of arguments about inheritance of acquired variation in the organic inheritance system through epigenetic inheritance. So maybe that's not as big a difference as we thought we'll see about that. You can have more than two parents. This is really important. You don't have to depend just on mom and dad for your information. You can get it from aunts and uncles, peers, grandparents, and nowadays, of course, mass media. So there's a very wide range of individuals involved in socializing children typically. And of course, as adults, we still continue to learn. At least some of us hope we do, even when we're 66, like I am. And this acquisition of other traits is biased. In other words, even babies are sentient beings and are capable of at least rudimentary kinds of discriminations of people and maybe even ideas. And so, to some extent, we're smart shoppers in the marketplace of ideas, and we have a variety of mechanisms, a variety of strategies we can use for acquiring our culture, and we're just not passive recipients the way we are of our genes. But nevertheless, those differences still leave a system that evolves by descent with modification. So this idea has been around ever since historical linguistics grew up. Darwin and the historical linguists in the 19th century noticed that there was an awful lot of similarity between the phylogenetic trees that they do. So language evolves a lot like species evolve. Now so there's just like in evolutionary biology, there's what I call a shifting concatenation of forces that play upon populations to cause evolution. And some of them are pretty strictly analogous to the forces that operate on genetic inheritance. So there's random variation in mutation-like effects and drift-like effects. And then there's natural selection on cultural variation. Bad habits will get you killed. Tribes with if we're thinking about group selection, tribes with weak institutions lose fights. Poorly run companies go bankrupt. That's an evolutionary idea that occurred to an economist by the name of Ahmed Alchian way back in 1950. In long surviving organizations, maybe school people and good practices. And then there are these decision-making forces that, as Rob and I call them, that are forces that don't have close analogs in the genetic inheritance system. At least we don't traditionally think so. So we can learn from personal experience, and then we can transmit that to other people. So that's a form of the inheritance of acquired variation, much as Darwin talked about. And then there's a biased transmission. If you're exposed to people who are doing things in two different ways or more, then you can use various decision-making rules to decide whether you want to do that or not. So, for example, you might try it out and see which one works better for you. Tennis serve or something like that. You can go out on the court and bang balls with one and bang balls with the other and see what you think feels best for you. You can use a conformity rule. When in Rome, do what the Romans do. You can imitate people who are prestigious or successful. Those happen to be particular rules that have been subject to a lot of theoretical and empirical analysis. So that's the basic scheme of forces that we think apply in cultural evolution. So the whole, I mean, if those green things weren't there, then it'd just be population genetics all over again, and the work could be done, or the work would be completely the same. The existence of those green forces means that the models require a fair amount of retailoring, and empirical studies require a fair amount of retooling as well to fit this. So this is a diagram of a sort of a comprehensive program of studies of cultural evolution. This came out of the last grant proposal. We've been actually recycling this diagram and putting dark boxes around the things that were actually going to be in the proposal and light boxes around the things that weren't going to be in there. So in our last proposal, we colored all these boxes, or put a dark border around all these boxes, and I don't know if that's the reason, but it didn't get funded. So this is a lesson in grantsmanship that you still keep learning lessons in grantsmanship. It seems even at an advanced age, so you'll all recognize all of this stuff, and so there's nothing really that an evolutionary biologist would find surprising about any of this, but for my social science colleagues, it takes a lot of discussion to sort of elaborate on these things. So I say making math models of culture is fun and easy. So you just march through the same things as if you were doing population genetics. Now you're modeling, say, the decisions of individuals rather than just assuming that that you're going to get a recombination sample from your parents. You model how the information is transmitted to individuals. What happens to individuals when they use that information? If you get bad information and use it, then natural selection will bite against you. If you get good information and use it, then you'll be subject to positive selection. And then you aggregate over populations and construct a recursion equation where there's a transmission part that you can show that under a wide variety of linear transmission schemes, you get a kind of a Hardy-Weinbergian effect that the transmission process by itself doesn't change frequencies, and then there are these various forces that I outlined in the previous slide, and then things unfold over time. The same old strategy that all of you are familiar with. So draw life histories and imagine where how the information flows down the generations, and model the evolutionary process in one generation. Iterate. Some of the things that turn out to be especially difficult. Lots of things are easy with humans. They're cheap to keep. You're not like rats. You don't have to pay a bill for to cage them and house them and all. They just walk in off the street for $10 and you can experiment on them. Some kinds of experiments, at any rate. Some things are really hard. This other adults. This is just a simple example, but when you get to the peers, other children, other adults, so people in the case of culture don't have a nice, neat two parents. You've got a rather large number of parents, and it's often hard to get your hands on all of these, or models we call them, cultural parents. You have a lot of influences before you make up your mind, and that causes a lot of difficulty. So that's just a bare sketch, but I hope it gives you a sense for what it is that cultural evolutionists do.